This is a screenshot video on the statute of frauds. I have addressed the statute of frauds just a little bit in the notes that I have put up in this unit of study, but I thought what we needed, since we're not working with a book, which, by the way, had a good section on the statute of frauds, I thought what we needed is simply an article that gave us a general overview of the statute of frauds. So that article is put up on Brightspace. I now have the article up on the screen, and I just want to make a few comments regarding the statute of frauds and the different categories of contracts that are covered by the statute of frauds. First, the statute of frauds is a law in contracts, or the law of contracts, that requires that some contracts, in order to be enforceable, must be in a writing signed by the party against whom enforcement is sought. Just so I have a specific example to use at this point, I'll jump ahead a little bit, and we can note that a contract for the sale of real estate is a contract covered by the statute of frauds. So therefore, if A is going to sell B, A's house, for that contract to be enforceable against A, then A must sign the written contract, and for the contract to be enforceable against B, B must sign the contract. Needless to say, when the contract is entered into, the only prudent thing to do, of course, is to have both parties, or if you will, if it's more than two parties, all parties sign the contract, so that if there's a need to enforce it, any party to the contract will be able to point to the fact that the party against whom enforcement is sought has signed the contract. Now, what I've done by putting up this article is given you the traditional categories of contracts that are covered by the statute of frauds. States, since contract law, states have variations, including New York, but these are the traditional categories, and I think for our purposes in this course, we can be content to be aware of these categories. And to some extent, the categories are self-explanatory. For example, first category, a contract that cannot by its terms be completed within a year's time. So if you and I entered into a 3-year contract, we cannot obviously complete the 3-year contract within a period of a year, so that would be the type of contract that must be signed for purposes of the statute of frauds. We've already talked about the second category, contracts for the sale, or other transfer of interest in real estate. What I would note in New York State, if it's a lease, because a lease involves the transfer of an interest, the interest there is the right of possession. The New York statute of frauds for leases requires that the lease be signed, if it obviously be in writing, and then be signed if it's for 1 or more years. If you have, if you're a renter of an apartment, let's say, you may have a month-to-month lease, and that's not a lease then that would be covered by the statute of frauds, and therefore would not need to be in a signed writing to be enforceable. The next category is contracts or promises where the consideration is marriage. And this gets us into what is sometimes known as prenups, or ante, nuptial agreements. The engagement ring stuff is freaky. I wouldn't worry about that. But I want you to know about prenups, because as we seem to be now in a time when Some folks are married more than once. It's not unusual, though it could be for the first marriage, it's not unusual for subsequent marriages to have parties enter into a prenup. What's also covered, and I did, though I don't do matrimonial law in my practice, I was sort of roped into doing a post-nuptial agreement between spouses. And again, the consideration would be marriage, and even though the marriage has already taken place, in that post-nup had to be in a signed writing. Contract for the sale of goods equal to or greater than $500, and that's from the Uniform Commercial Code. Number 5, and it's called a contract of suretyship, and they describe it as a contract where one party agrees to act as a guarantor or on behalf of another party concerning a debt or other obligation. And this category is sometimes known as a contract to answer for the debt of another. And so let me just, I think there's some practicality here that we ought to maybe spend a little bit of time on. Often, two or more people enter into a contract on one side. For example, spouses buy a car. And that sometimes is referred to as co-signing, meaning that, to continue with the example, both spouses would promise to pay to the finance company the loan that's been taken out to purchase the car. Sometimes, by the way, we see co-signing even though between the co-signers there's sort of an accommodation. And let me give you an example. When some of my children were purchasing their first car, they couldn't, because they were still kind of young, hadn't developed a sufficient credit to get any kind of a decent loan, so I would agree to co-sign the loan with them. And then the strength of my credit, so to speak, gave the lender the justification in terms of its business for making the loan. But in that case, the co-signing case, even though it was reflected in the signed writing, that's not what we're talking about here. Because I was, along with the child involved, making a direct promise to the finance company that I would pay. What we're concerned about in category number 5 is where someone is saying, let's say again to a lender, I will guarantee the loan if the other person doesn't pay. We can almost take this as an indirect promise. And I can give you, to use my family experiences, I had a brother who had a landscaping business in another state, and he occasionally needed an expensive piece of equipment, had some difficulties with his credit history, yet I didn't want to be a co-signer, as for example, in terms of my children, because I really, unlike my kids, had not a lot of control over what was going on. So what I offered to do, and sometimes this is how the deal went down, I offered to guarantee his payment so that if he didn't pay, then I could be held responsible. Notice in the co-signing situation, though, where I was co-signing a loan, let's say you could say with a spouse, or in my case I used the example of the kid, the lender wouldn't have to come to me and say, the kid didn't pay, now you've got to pay. The lender could come directly to me and say, you know what, the bill was due April 1st and it hasn't been paid, you're late. So there's a difference between co-signing and guarantee. I just wanted to use this to put it into place. I'm not worried about category 6 other than to say it's an estate deal, and I don't want to spend the time in the contract course to walk through this. I think what we've got, and this is what I'm going to be content with, is a basic understanding that there are categories of contracts that to be enforceable, they have to be in a writing and have to be signed by the party against whom enforcement is sought. And practicality would dictate, therefore, that every party to that contract ought to sign it, because we don't know as time goes by against whom enforcement might be sought. One final word. Let's take a type of contract that isn't covered by the statute of frauds, and let's identify personal services contract. Most personal services contracts don't have to be in a signed writing, and yet I'm just thinking if you were hiring somebody to paint your house this spring and summer, and though that would not be a contract that had to be in writing according to the statute of frauds, I think wisdom would dictate for both you and the painting company that you'd want to have that writing or that contract in writing. That way, and I'm not thinking someone's going to run a scam, but that's certainly been known to happen. What I'm thinking is that everybody ought to be, quote, on the same page, end of quote, so that there's no mistaking when the progress payments are due. There's no mistaking who's responsible for the material that's needed to paint the house. There's no mistaking about when the job should be completed, and we don't have to trust our memories as time goes by, or for that matter, perhaps trust the honesty of the other person because we have it in a writing. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, if you're having your house painted this summer, that you need to run out and hire a lawyer to put together the contract. It might be that the painting company has a contract, in which case read it very carefully, and you can certainly suggest your own terms. But what I am saying is, if you're going to have that done, let's assume it's a college kid. You're hiring her to paint your house. Sit down and get a couple pieces of paper, the two of you, and put down in writing what the expectations are, sign it and date it. Okay, that's going to complete our statute of frauds material, screenshot video at least.